Dylan Mason had always taken pride in the fact that his garage was more than just a place to store a vehicle. It was his sanctuary, a carefully maintained workshop where every tool had its place, every surface gleamed with order, and the air carried the faint, comforting scent of machine oil and polished steel. The crown jewel of this space was his restored 1974 Harley-Davidson, a bike he had spent 2 painstaking years bringing back from a rusted shell to a shining work of mechanical art. Its chrome reflected the overhead lights like liquid silver, and the black leather seat still carried the faint aroma of the conditioner he used weekly. Dylan often said the garage was the one place where the world outside could not intrude. It was where his mind could slow down, his hands could find their rhythm, and the only problems that mattered were the ones he could solve with a wrench and some patience. That illusion shattered in an instant on a Thursday morning that began as unremarkably as any other. He had driven into town early to pick up a few sheets of plywood for a shelving project he was planning, enjoying the cool air and the quiet streets. When he returned, the first thing he noticed was the deep, throaty growl of a diesel engine rumbling somewhere ahead, a sound that didn't belong on his usually silent block. As he turned onto his street, the sight that met him was so jarring he slowed to a crawl without realizing it. Parked at the edge of his driveway was a massive concrete mixer truck, its drum slowly rotating, the mechanical whine of its hydraulics filling the air. Thick hoses snaked from the truck into his open garage, where a pair of workers in bright orange safety vests were guiding a wide, wet flow of cement across the smooth floor he had so carefully kept pristine. For a second, Dylan thought it had to be some kind of mistake, a wrong address, an accident in progress, and that any moment they would look up, realize the error, and scramble to stop. But then his gaze fell on the bike, standing where he had left it, the concrete already pooling around the wheels, climbing up the frame in a creeping, irreversible tide of gray. One of the men barked instructions over the noise, adjusting the hose's aim to spread the mixture evenly, as if they were doing nothing more than following a routine order. Dylan's stomach tightened with a surge of disbelief that threatened to break into anger, but years of experience had taught him that the first reaction in a crisis often defined its outcome. He pulled his truck to the curb, cut the engine, and stepped out slowly, his phone already in his hand. Without saying a word, he began taking pictures, first wide shots to capture the truck, the workers, and the open garage, then close-ups of the cement climbing up the gleaming motorcycle and the wet splatter marks on his workbench. He made sure to photograph the truck's license plate, the company name stenciled on the side, and the faces of the 2 men who avoided looking at him but made no move to stop their work. The smell of wet cement was sharp in the air, mixing unpleasantly with the faint tang of oil and rubber that still lingered from his bike, and every second that passed felt like another nail sealing the coffin on months of labor and care. Dylan's mind raced, not with accusations or insults, but with the sequence of steps he needed to take. Call the police to have the incident documented, avoid any physical confrontation that could be turned against him, gather every shred of evidence. Before anyone could claim it never happened, in that moment, as the drum on the truck groaned and turned and the wet gray tide swallowed the last visible inch of the Harley's tires, Dylan understood that whatever this was, it was no accident, and that the fight to undo it was going to be long, messy, and very public. Dylan didn't raise his voice or rush forward because he could see that both men were the kind who would immediately fall back on just doing my job as a shield, and the more emotion he showed, the more they would twist the story if this ended up in court. He stood just far enough away to stay out of the wet splash zone, but close enough to let them know he wasn't going anywhere. And when one of them finally glanced up, Dylan met his gaze with the kind of steady, unblinking look that said he wasn't going to be brushed aside. The man hesitated, looked to his coworker, then waved vaguely toward a clipboard resting on the back of the truck. "It's an order from the neighborhood board," he said, as if that explained everything, his voice pitched to carry over the noise of the mixer. Dylan walked over to the clipboard, flipping the top sheet over without asking permission, and saw a single-page document that claimed the garage floor was unsafe for continued use and required emergency leveling to meet community safety standards. There was no signature at the bottom, only a typed name, and the date was that morning. The address was his, printed neatly in bold type, but something about the language didn't sit right. It read like boilerplate, the kind of generic form you could use on any property, with no specific notes about his garage or the supposed hazard. Dylan didn't comment. Instead, he took a clear photo of the page and stepped back, noting how the man made no move to stop him. At that moment, the deep, slow crunch of tires on asphalt announced another vehicle pulling up, and Dylan turned to see a dark green SUV rolling to a stop across the street. Out stepped Linda Carey, the president of the neighborhood board, dressed in an immaculately pressed beige blazer, her hair swept into the kind of severe bun that seemed designed to keep her expression in place. She didn't greet him. Instead, she stood at the curb, arms folded, surveying the work like a foreman inspecting progress. "Mr. Mason," she called, her tone flat and faintly impatient. "This is being handled per our authority to maintain safety compliance. The floor in your garage has been reported as hazardous." Dylan asked who had reported it, but she only offered a small shrug, as if the source of the complaint were irrelevant. "The decision was made this morning," she added, glancing toward the workers as if to urge them to keep going. Dylan felt a slow burn rise in his chest, but he kept his voice even. "You're aware that you're destroying personal property without a proper warrant or even a signed order? That motorcycle alone is worth more than the entire job you're doing here." Linda's lips curved into a thin, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If you have a problem with the procedure, you can file a formal complaint. In the meantime, I suggest you let the professionals finish before someone gets hurt." That last phrase, "before someone gets hurt," wasn't shouted or stressed, but the weight behind it made Dylan's skin prickle. He didn't reply. Instead, he pulled out his phone again, scrolled to his contacts, and tapped the number for the non-emergency police line, explaining in a clear, deliberate voice that unpermitted work was being carried out on his property and that it involved destruction of valuable personal property. Within minutes, a patrol car turned the corner and rolled to a stop at the curb. The officer who stepped out was young, polite, and looked slightly uncomfortable as Dylan explained the situation and showed the photos he'd already taken. The officer took notes, asked the workers for their paperwork, and photographed the same single-page form Dylan had seen earlier. When he asked for a permit number, the brawnier of the two workers just shrugged and said it was handled through the board. The officer's brow furrowed, but after a short exchange with Linda, he returned to Dylan and admitted there was little he'd could do to stop the work on the spot without a definitive ruling from a city inspector. He did, however, give Dylan a copy of the incident report number and promised that the photographs and his statement would be part of the official record. Dylan nodded, thanked him, and watched as the officer drove off, leaving the low roar of the mixer as the only sound on the street. By now, the bike was almost completely swallowed, the glint of chrome reduced to a few dull flecks under the heavy gray mass. Dylan knew the damage was beyond repair, but the evidence he'd gathered was intact, and that meant the real fight could begin. He stepped back, leaned against the hood of his truck, and kept filming in silence until the workers finally pulled the hose free and began smoothing the surface with long, deliberate strokes, their movements indifferent to the destruction they had just carried out. Linda gave him one last look, a quick, assessing glance, and then walked briskly to her SUV without another word. As she drove away, Dylan realized that whatever her game was, she expected him to take this as a final decision. He smiled to himself, not because any of this was amusing, but because it meant she had no idea just how patient and methodical he could be when someone tried to corner him. Dylan had barely slept that night, the image of his Harley vanishing beneath a slow, suffocating tide of concrete looping in his mind like some cruel film reel. By the time the pale light of morning slipped through his blinds, he had already showered, made coffee, and opened his laptop, determined to turn whatever shock he'd felt into a plan that could actually move the situation forward. The incident report from the police sat on his desk, alongside the photos he had printed from his phone, each one time-stamped and annotated in neat handwriting. He began by searching the city's online permit database, a system he had used once before when checking the paperwork on a neighbor's roof replacement. It took only minutes to confirm what he had suspected. There was no permit issued for any work on his property in the last year, let alone the so-called emergency leveling job from yesterday. The absence of an entry wasn't just an oversight. It meant that whatever paperwork the workers had shown him was either fabricated or based on internal authorizations that carried no legal weight outside the board's closed meetings. That thought sharpened into something colder when he realized this wasn't just a dispute about property damage. It was a calculated move, and someone had gone to the trouble of creating a false trail to justify it. Rather than fire off angry emails to the board or confront Linda again, Dylan made a quieter decision. He printed the non-existent permit record from the city's website, attached copies of his photos, and drove to the municipal building downtown. The construction compliance office was a sterile space of beige walls and scuffed linoleum floors, where a middle-aged clerk with wire-framed glasses listened intently as Dylan laid out the sequence of events without embellishment. When he slid the printed order across the counter, she frowned, adjusted her glasses, and turned it toward the light as if the paper itself might confess something. "This isn't one of ours," she said finally, tapping the blank signature line. "It's not even formatted the way our forms are. Whoever issued this didn't go through us." She made a quick note on a yellow slip and said she would forward the information to the city's enforcement division, which could formally demand an explanation from the board. It was exactly the kind of official trigger Dylan had wanted, something that shifted the burden of proof away from him and onto the people who had set this in motion. Driving home, he noticed a white sedan parked 2 houses down from his driveway, engine idling, the driver pretending to scroll through a phone. It might have been nothing, but the way the car lingered until Dylan stepped out of his truck, then pulled away without so much as a glance, added a faint metallic edge to his thoughts. That edge sharpened later in the afternoon when an envelope slid through his mail slot with no stamp and no return address. Inside was a printed notice from the board, stating that he had been fined for interfering with sanctioned safety operations, and that continued obstruction could result in further administrative action, including suspension of property. Privileges. Dylan almost laughed aloud at the phrasing. Suspension of property privileges, as if his garage were a club membership they could revoke. He placed the letter alongside the fake order, knowing it would be just as useful in building a case. What he hadn't expected was the sudden silence from the people who had been so eager to act only the day before. Linda didn't appear at his door. No follow-up calls came from the board's office, and none of the workers returned. The concrete floor in his garage sat smooth and cold under the harsh glow of the overhead lights, the bike buried beneath it like a fossil. Dylan resisted the urge to start breaking it up himself. Every instinct screamed at him to take back control, but he knew that disturbing the scene could be twisted into an admission that the work had been legitimate. For now, the evidence had to stay exactly as it was. By evening, he had compiled a binder with every document, photo, and note in chronological order, along with a USB drive containing the original image files and videos from his phone. That binder went into a fireproof lockbox along with a written statement of the events, signed and dated. It wasn't paranoia. It was insurance against the quiet kind of tampering that came when people thought you weren't paying attention. Dylan had seen enough petty power plays in his life to know that once someone escalated to destruction of property, they rarely stopped there. They doubled down, convinced they could wear you out through persistence. As he sat at his kitchen table, flipping through the binder one last time, a message popped up on his phone from an unknown number. It was a single sentence. "Stop making this harder than it needs to be." There was no signature, no context, but the timing was too precise to ignore. Dylan stared at it for a long moment before forwarding it to his email and saving a screenshot. If they thought vague intimidation would push him toward a quiet settlement, They had chosen the wrong man. Whatever patience he had was now anchored to something heavier, a need to see exactly how far they were willing to go and to be ready when they crossed the next line. 2 days passed without any official word from the city's enforcement division, though Dillon knew that kind of machinery moved slowly. In the meantime, the smooth concrete slab in his garage sat like a gravestone, sealing away not only the bike but a part of his trust in the idea that one's property was truly their own. He avoided going in there unless he had to, preferring to work from the smaller tool shed in the backyard, but even that space had started to feel less secure. His unease sharpened late on the third afternoon when his phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end belonged to a man who identified himself only as Martin, saying he lived 3 streets over and had something he thought Dillon should see. There was a caution in the man's tone, as if he were measuring every word, and when Dillon asked for details, Martin only said, "It's better if I just hand it to you in person," before naming a diner off the highway and hanging up. Dillon didn't rush. He locked the house, checked the dashcam in his truck to ensure it was recording, and took a route that looped through a few side streets before heading toward the diner, partly to make sure he wasn't being followed. When he arrived, Martin was already in a corner booth, a man in his late 40s with the kind of posture that came from a life of manual work, broad shoulders, a slight stoop, and hands roughened by calluses. He slid a small padded envelope across the table without ceremony. Inside, Dillon found a USB drive and a folded piece of paper. The paper was a photocopy of what appeared to be a delivery log for a concrete supplier, listing dates, times, addresses, and job descriptions. Dillon's address was on the list, but beside it, under work type, someone had handwritten leveling board order, and then, faintly in pencil, the words swap from 417 North to 224 West. The handwriting was the kind that came from rushing, letters slanted and uneven. When Dillon asked where it had come from, Martin kept his eyes on his coffee. He said he'd been working part-time for the subcontractor that supplied the crew, mostly hauling equipment, and had overheard 2 of the workers joking about how the guy with the bike was going to lose his mind when he saw what was coming. At first, he thought they were bluffing, but then he'd seen the log and realized the address switch wasn't just sloppy paperwork. It was intentional. "They don't keep stuff like that for long," Martin said quietly. "If you want to use it, you'd better copy it fast." Dillon nodded, thanked him, and paid for their coffees before leaving. Back home, he plugged in the USB drive and found it contained a series of scanned emails between the subcontractor and a private Gmail account labeled only LC. The messages discussed scheduling maintenance interventions at specific properties, but the language was deliberately vague. No mention of what was being done, only that materials will be applied and target site access is confirmed. One message included a note that read, "Ensure no city oversight. Keep within board handling." Dillon felt his jaw tighten as he read the timestamps. 2 of the messages had been sent just hours before the truck arrived at his garage. Rather than confront anyone directly, he forwarded the files to his lawyer, attaching the photos and the fake work order from earlier. He didn't expect an immediate miracle, but he knew a lawyer's request for explanation carried more weight than anything he could send himself. That night, he got a brief reply. Received. Recommend you do not contact board or contractors directly. Will initiate formal demand tomorrow. The following morning, Dillon noticed a change in the air, subtle but enough to make him pause as he stepped onto his porch with his coffee. The white sedan from earlier in the week was back, parked farther down this time, half hidden by a row of maples. A man sat in the driver's seat, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, holding a phone at an angle that might have been innocent, but lingered just a moment too long in Dillon's direction. He ignored it outwardly, but inside, a knot of cold certainty began to form. This wasn't random anymore. Someone wanted him to know they were watching. Around noon, he received an email from the city's enforcement division. They had reviewed the documents he'd provided and found no record of approved work matching the description or address. The email went on to say they had issued a notice to the board requesting all relevant permits and work orders with a deadline to respond in 5 business days. While it wasn't the decisive blow he wanted, it meant the clock was now ticking for the other side. That evening, as he was locking up the shed, Dylan heard the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel behind the fence line. He froze, listening, and caught the low murmur of voices. 2 men speaking too quietly to make out words. He stepped toward the sound, but by the time he reached the gate, the noise had faded, and the alley behind his property was empty except for a faint smell of cigarette smoke drifting on the damp air. He knew better than to chase shadows, but the message was clear. They weren't content with watching from a distance anymore. Back inside, he sat at the kitchen table reviewing the timeline of events he'd built in his binder. It was now impossible to dismiss the pattern. Fake documentation, address manipulation, coordinated delivery, and now passive surveillance. The midpoint wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. It was about understanding that the people on the other end of this were willing to cross lines without hesitation, and that the next move they made would likely be bolder, riskier, and harder to undo. Dylan poured himself another coffee, the kind of late-night fuel he usually reserved for tinkering with engines, and stared at the binder's open pages. If they thought they could wear him down through intimidation and pressure, they were about to learn just how stubborn he could be when cornered. By the end of the week, the situation had shifted from a quiet standoff to something that felt more like an open challenge. The city's enforcement division had confirmed to Dylan's lawyer that the board had failed to respond by the stated deadline, which meant a second, more formal notice would be issued, one that could trigger fines or further legal action. It was a small victory on paper, but Dylan knew it would not go unanswered. That knowledge proved right early Saturday morning when he stepped outside to find a fresh notice taped to his front door, printed on the same letterhead as the previous fines, but this time accusing him of storing hazardous materials in an unapproved structure and demanding immediate removal. The irony that the hazardous materials were locked inside a garage they themselves had entombed in concrete was almost laughable. But the intent behind the letter was clear. They were creating a paper trail to portray him as a problem resident. He didn't tear the notice down immediately. Instead, he photographed it in place, front and back, making sure the time and date stamp were visible, then carefully removed it and added it to his growing file. Later that morning, he walked the perimeter of his property and found that the side gate's padlock had been tampered with. Deep scratches surrounded the keyhole, and a small piece of metal, possibly from a broken pick, was still lodged inside. He took more photos, sent them to his lawyer, and decided against replacing the lock immediately. Whoever had done it would see the damage was untouched, and perhaps assume he was unaware, which might encourage them to try again under circumstances he could better prepare for. That preparation came in the form of a quiet call to a security company that specialized in temporary surveillance setups. By that evening, 2 discrete motion-activated cameras were installed, one overlooking the alley near the damaged gate, the other angled toward the front of the garage. Dylan didn't plan to monitor them obsessively. He wanted the footage to speak for itself when the time came. The first test came sooner than expected. Just after midnight, one of the cameras caught 2 figures approaching from the alley, both wearing dark hooded jackets and gloves. They moved with the kind of slow, deliberate pace that suggested they weren't in a hurry because they thought they were unseen. One crouched near the gate, producing a set of tools from a small pouch, while the other kept glancing toward the house. Dylan, watching the live feed from his phone in the dim light of his bedroom, didn't rush outside. He let the camera capture everything. The tools, the faces partially visible under the hoods, the moment the gate swung open and the pair stepped inside. Only then did he pick up the phone and dial the non-emergency police line, giving the